A reading from the book of Numbers. With their patience worn out by the journey, the people complained against God and Moses. "Why have you brought us up from Egypt to die in this desert, where there is no food or water? We are disgusted with this wretched food." In punishment, the Lord sent among the people seraph serpents, which bit the people so that many of them died. Then the people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned in complaining against the Lord and you. Pray the Lord to take the serpents from us." So Moses prayed for the people, and the Lord said to Moses, "Make a seraph and mount it upon a pole, and if any who have been bitten look at it, they will live." Moses accordingly made a bronze serpent and mounted it on a pole. And whenever anyone who had been bitten by a serpent looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Growing up in an exile family, in an exile household, something that I heard a lot of was, the milk used to be fuller bodied in Cuba. It just tasted better. And then later on, going to church in immigrant communities, I'd hear the same type of thing. The stars were much brighter back home. Here, you can barely see the stars. You'd hear all these sorts of things, how people were more communal, how people got along better, how there's, lack of morality where we are, and all sorts of different complaints and grumbling about where we are now. And when reading from Numbers, it was very easy to identify in some ways with the experience of the Israelite people, because this is a very common experience for migrants, for people who, for whatever reason, are forced to move from one place to another. The curious thing is that in many instances, the reasons people are migrating are inconceivable and make one think, how would you compare what you have now with what you left behind? In the example of my own family, there came a point in the 1960s and since then when, milk is very hard to come by in Cuba. So, to talk about how much better the milk was when you barely had milk to drink, But this is a very common experience for the immigrant. And curiously, one of the things that happens in this particular story is the sort of punishment that God metes out in order to respond to this grumbling and complaining. And Don spoke very eloquently this morning about a very powerful way of understanding what that means, or what that could mean. What's curious about it to me is that the cure that is offered is actually based on or derives from the punishment itself. If you notice, God doesn't just say, okay, I'm going to forgive the people for their grumbling and I'm going to simply cure them. Rather, God has Moses lift up a bronze serpent, something in the figure of the thing that was killing them, in order to heal them. Now, what's curious about this is that there's a certain logic to this. When we look at different forms of healing, for example, vaccines, we know that in a vaccination, there's kind of a similar thing that happens. You take a little bit of the pathogen, a little dead, I'm not a science major, but, and you use that, you put it into the person's body, and somehow that triggers some sort of mechanism by which they develop a resistance to whatever it is, right? And there are other similar examples. For example, if you look at the healing professions, at the helping professions, social workers, psychologists, teachers, and so on, there are many people in those professions, and in ministry too, who have been through some very harrowing experiences and who say, I'm going to use my experience of having been through X, Y, or Z in order to help other people heal who have been through that same X, Y, or Z. So there's a kind of psychological and very human logic to the way that God chooses to grant healing to the Jewish people in this reading. But when we read this through the lens of the New Testament and through the lens of Christian faith, it adds on a whole additional layer. Because our Christian tradition tells us that the staff that gets raised up is a prefiguration of the cross of Jesus Christ. And when we look at the incarnation, we come to the realization that the way that God in the new covenant chooses to save God's people from the wounds inflicted by the fact that they're wanderers. Because remember that the path of the Jewish people is a paradigm for the whole human condition. We're all wandering. From the time we're born to the time we die, we're grumbling. We know that something is not complete. There's always something that we're looking for. And when we try to do something to get that something, we always find something missing. It was always better where we were, even though it may have been a hole. So what is the cure to that snake bite that we all experience? Well, the cure is that God chooses to become another wandering Jew. God becomes a wanderer, and God wanders with us. This is the message, this is the power of the cross. In becoming another wanderer, God chooses to gladly undergo not only uncertainty, not only suffering, not only pain, not only the temptation to grumble and to maybe think, oh man, how good I had it in the Godhead, but also to undergo the very real experience of dying, of actually having to let go of one's earthly life. And so if we understand that events in salvation history, and particularly that the life of Jesus Christ is itself not only the mirror, not only the greatest and the most accurate sign we have of who God is, but also of who human beings are called to be, and of what fully realized humanity is supposed to be, then there should be a model there. St. Thomas would talk about the fittingness of how God does what God chooses to do. And I would say that it's fitting that God should have chosen this means of saving us for the simple reason that it provides a model, which is not far from what Thomas says in a different way, no? God provides a model for us in Jesus Christ. What is that model? Very simple. We're supposed to identify with our status as wanderers, and then we're supposed to help and accompany others in their wandering, which is more or less along the lines of what Henry Nouwen talks about in The Wounded Healer, for those of you who have read that. But the interesting thing about this is that on a human, purely psychological level, this makes sense. But when you introduce the element of grace, and you see this as consciously taking on the pattern of the Paschal Mystery and uniting that to the pattern of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, suddenly there's a transformative power that wandering with others takes on that goes way beyond the already considerable power that it has on a purely human level. And so it becomes the expression of our baptismal call, our baptismal priesthood and prophetic and office and kingship. And it also becomes, for those of us who dedicate our lives to ministry, it becomes the model, because Jesus Christ is the model for how we do ministry and for what we do. So whatever we do and whatever we dedicate our lives to, let's commit ourselves on this day of days to accompanying others as wanderers, patterning ourselves on the wanderer with a capital W, Jesus Christ, and let's pray together, we adore you, O Christ, and we bless you. For by your wandering with us in your cross and resurrection, you have redeemed the world.